Hi, my name's Kira Withers-Jones and I'm a textile artist. So I make different types of art out of scraps of fabric, nice new fabrics. I often use machine embroidery, sometimes hand embroidery. What I've got for you to do in this project is a picture made out of little pieces of fabric. They are appliqued onto the background, and then I've done some machine and hand embroidery over the top. You don't have to use machine embroidery if you haven't got a sewing machine, but I wanted to show you how to do it. And you can make whatever design that you want to make. I've done a wonky little house because I like that sort of thing, but you could do a cat or any scene you want, really. That's up to you to design. So for this you'll need a background piece of fabric. This could be a piece of cotton sheeting, something like that. And then you'll need a range of scraps. So a good range of colours is a nice idea. I've also used Bondaweb. That's something I'll explain to you in a little bit. I've used my sewing machine and a basic black sewing machine thread. And then I've used some hand embroidery thread and some hand embroidery needles. Right, I've started off by creating some thumbnails. So I've come up with a few ideas of what I could make. I've got quite a straight standard idea of a house, but I've also done a funky, more angular house, which can look quite nice with this technique. You've got a tree there on a hill and a cat that I've drawn. So just coming up with a few ideas, and what would be really good is if you filled a page like this with thumbnails so that you've got a lot of ideas that you can work with, and then if you pick the one that you prefer and start to work with that, and gather together some scrap fabrics or new fabrics, whatever you've got, gather them together and you can see what colours you've got that might work with your idea that you've put together. So I've got a lot of offcuts here, different pieces of fabric, different colours, different things that I can use. And I'm just going to go through these and work out what I think will look good with the idea that I've come up with. And then I will start to use the Bondaweb and cut out, and that will come together quite nicely. If you haven't heard of Bondaweb before, what it is basically a sheet of glue which has got paper on one side, and this means that you can stick it onto fabric and then peel the paper off and leave the fabric sticky. But the thing about Bondaweb is that it is only activated when you heat it up with the iron. So you iron it onto the fabric, and then it cools down and it's stuck on the fabric permanently until you heat it up again, and then you can stick that piece of fabric onto another piece of fabric. I'll show you how that works in just a minute. Cut your piece of Bondaweb to roughly the size of the first scrap that you're going to use. You can tell which side has the glue on because it's a bit rougher, and then you've just got like a greaseproof paper on the back. So put it with the rough side down onto the back of your piece of fabric and iron it down. Now it's not like if you're ironing clothes and you're moving the iron around a lot. You need to have heat and pressure all in one area, all at the same time. I've just turned that up so it's a little bit hotter. You need to get some good heat into it. And slowly move across your piece of Bondaweb and make sure that all the areas of the Bondaweb get nice and hot. You want to put a little bit of pressure, not too much. You don't need to push down hard on the iron, but you need to make sure that the weight of the iron really gets onto the fabric. Does tend to change just a little bit in that it goes a little bit grey when it's actually stuck down, and I can also test it around the edges with my fingernails, and I can see that's not peeling off, so that's stuck down now. So what I need to do is wait for this to cool down. It's quite hot at the moment, so I can't do much with it while it's hot, but I'm just going to show you how I'm going to draw onto the back of the paper So I'm going to do a hill with this, typical green hill. It doesn't matter if you go a bit wrong with your drawing, because you're not going to see this afterwards. You're just going to cut this out now. So I've just drawn a really rough hill, and I'm going to cut that out. Ideally you would leave this until it's fully cooled down before doing this, but I'm just going to show you while it's still warm. So there's my hill. I've made that with a scrap of green batik fabric that I had. I've obviously used that in something else, and that was a bit of a leftover. Now what I need to do is just peel off the backing. So there, it's coming away quite easily. Sometimes it sticks a bit harder, and that's the tricky bit. If you're trying to get to the edge, you know, if I was doing it up here, it might not want to come off very well. The trick for that, if you're having trouble, is to get a pin and scratch away in the middle until you can get a bit that you can lift away. But this is peeling away nicely. And I don't know if you can see, there's a bit of a shine to that now. It doesn't look quite the same as the right side, and it's got a bit of a rubbery feel, and that's where the glue is. So what I can do now is stick it onto a backing sheet. So here's a piece of plain fabric. This could be something like a cotton sheeting. This is just a piece of plain white cotton fabric. I've already ironed it, and I'm going to work fairly centrally. We're going to leave a space around the edge because I don't know what I'm going to do with this yet, if I'm going to frame it or put it onto a canvas. So I want to leave a nice gap around the edge, and I'm going to work in this middle section. And all I do now is iron it exactly as I did before. So the Bondo web is being heated up by the iron, and this will make it stick down. It takes around 20 seconds. It depends on how big the piece is, really. If you've got a tiny little piece like that, it's only going to take you 10-15 seconds. But if you've got a large piece that you're needing to move around to keep the heat on, it will take you a bit longer. But that should be fine for this size of piece. And again, feel around the edges to see if it's stuck. Right, that edge hasn't stuck very well, so I'll just go over that again. And my Bondo web didn't go quite down to the bottom, so I know that edge won't be quite perfectly stuck, but that's fine. I can deal with that when I'm sewing it. But that is the start of my piece. Now I'm going to go through my other scraps and see what I'm going to do on the top. Put in a house shape, roof, lots of different colours, so I'll work on that now. Here's my house now that I've finished sticking all of the pieces of fabric down. So I've used the Bondo web on the back of all of these, including the windows, the door, the little path there. So that's all stuck down. If you haven't got any Bondo web, because it's not the kind of thing that you tend to have in the house all the time, what you can do is, if I show you on the side of here, take your piece of fabric and just put a little dab of Pritt stick down and put your fabric on top. So there we go, you can see that better. So put that on top of where you've put the Pritt stick, and then pin it very carefully around the edges. So you want it to be nice and flat. You don't want any ruckles in it, and you want to have it well pinned. And then it won't move when you put it under the sewing machine. That's what's important here, that it's not going to wriggle about. So there, that's flat and it's pinned down, so I could now put that under the sewing machine. I'd have to be careful with the pins and taking them out as I sew that section. Or of course you might be hand stitching it, in which case once you've sewn a bit down you can take out the pin then. So what we do next is I'm going to do some machine sewing on this with free machine embroidery, and I'll explain when I get to the machine how to set that up and make that happen. But first of all we need to stabilise this. So what I've got here is a piece of wadding. If you've ever made a quilt or you've got any family members that do quilt making, they'll use wadding like this. And we can put that onto the wadding. That's how I like to do free machine embroidery. Everyone's a bit different on how they do it. I like to use the wadding to give my fabric a bit of stiffness. Some other people use, this is called stitch and tear. It's quite a stiff, fibrous kind of fabric. It's classed as a non-woven, so it's not like the cotton that we're sewing onto. It's like a man-made piece of fabric. That will give you quite a bit of stiffness if you pin that onto the back. You could also put it into an embroidery hoop if you've got one, especially if you're doing hand sewing, you might want to use an embroidery hoop. But what I'm going to do is pin it down onto the wadding, and I'm wanting to keep smoothing the fabric down so that I don't end up with any ruckles, the same as with the little scrap I showed you there. We want this to sew nice and flat. So I'll use lots of pins, and I might take them out while I'm sewing if they're starting to get in my way. You want nice sharp pins because a blunt one can actually do harm to the fabric. So nice and sharp. I'm going to pin all the way around the edge of my picture. So I'll keep doing that, keep going all the way around the edge, and then I'll show you what we do next on the sewing machine. Okay, so I've moved across to the sewing machine now. Currently it's set up for normal stitching, so I've got a standard foot on there, and you can see these little ridges or the jaggedy areas that are underneath the foot. They're called the feed dogs. We don't want those to be up when we're doing the free motion embroidery, so I'm going to put those down. It might be that your sewing machine has got a button behind the base of the sewing machine. It might be on the control area, or it might be round to the side. So I flicked the switch on mine and my feed dogs have gone down. I also need to change the foot. So there's a screw just to the side, which means I can take the normal foot off. And now I've got a darning foot. It's difficult for you to see because this one's made of clear plastic. They might be round or they might be an oval shape like this. They might be made of metal, they might be clear plastic, and also they might have a spring on them or they might not. It depends on your particular machine and what darning foot you've got. But if you look through the instructions, they're normally called a darning foot, possibly a free motion foot. That should just attach on to the shank, and then you do the screw up, and then that's fitted on there. Why this is important is the normal foot puts pressure on the top of the fabric and the feed dogs are underneath, and they're pulling along and they pull the fabric because of that pressure down. Now we've got rid of the feed dogs, so there's no jaggedy edge pulling the fabric around, and this foot doesn't go down onto the fabric, it stays above. It might float above, or if you've got the spring it might bounce up and down slightly, but it doesn't put pressure on the fabric. That means that we can move it however we want to. It's not just being pulled through by the machine. So I'll go on to the edge of the piece that I've been working on and just give you a little demonstration. I always make sure that I've got threads coming out to the side so that I can hold them. If you start off without holding those threads, you might get a bit of a bird's nest in the back. And even though we're not using the foot touching the fabric, we still need to put the presser foot down. So use whatever handle that you've got to do that. So if I put my foot down, the fabric not moving anywhere. The needle is going up and down, and my foot is bouncing because of the type of darning foot that I've got, but the fabric isn't being pulled through. So it's just staying in one place. But I can pull the fabric back and forth. It's a bit ruckly because I'm doing it right at the edge of the fabric. It's better if you do it in the middle of the fabric. But I'm moving the fabric in whatever direction I want so that I can get a big wibbly line. It's not very easy for you to see because of the lighting. There's quite a bright light underneath here. So I will just cut this off. And there you can see I've gone in every direction and the machine hasn't controlled that at all. I've just used the sewing machine like a pen really, and I've just drawn across my fabric. So that's what we're going to do. So I'll pull some long ends out so that I can get to the middle of my fabric. I think I'll start down here in the corner. Now the key thing is that you put your foot down on the pedal so that you get enough speed out of the machine. You don't want to be going too slowly, but you don't want to move the fabric too fast. It's better to be faster with the pedal, which means the needle is going up and down fast, but slower up top. If you're slow with the needle and fast up top, you'll end up with jumping stitches. You won't have a lot of flow to it, might pull on the fabric. So we want to get it just right. So if I start there, that beep is a little warning to tell me I've got the feed dog down, just in case I don't know. Oh, actually that beep was telling me I hadn't put the foot down. That's an extra beep. So that's really useful. Your machine might not have that, but it tells me I hadn't put the foot down, so I really shouldn't be sewing like that. There we go. So the needle is going up and down quite fast, but I'm not moving the fabric very fast. So I've sewn up the side there. Now I'm going to go around that bush. And basically I'm just outlining things as if I had a black pen, like a fine liner or something, and I'm just going all the way around every feature on my picture. Go around the bush, go up the side of the house. And your lines are not going to be perfect and they're not going to be straight, and that's okay. That's part of this. If you want to practice really hard, you can get them straighter, but for this, that's not what we're doing, so don't worry about it. The key thing is to get the speed right so that you can move the fabric and just draw, all freehand. If you haven't got a sewing machine, just do exactly the same thing with your hand stitching. Go all the way around it, do an outline. I'm using a black thread so that it will show up. It's quite nice to get that very drawn looking line. And I'm joining back up, so I've gone around the chimney and then I've joined up again with where my line was on the roof. It means that you will go over some bits twice. And I'm going to join up with where I was on the roof, all the way over to the other side. I'll now move the camera angle so that you can see better. You've seen me stitching from the side. I'll see if I can get it looking down so that you can see me actually stitching. Hopefully you can now see a little bit better how it's looking under the needle. It's difficult to get a good camera position for this, but we'll give it a go. So I'm just following the line of the fabric along. I'm going to sew down the edge now, and then I'll come back and I'll do the features. Around the door. As you can see, my stitching isn't perfect. It's just giving a bit of a drawn line. It does actually look more interesting if the line isn't perfect. Over to the window. If you were hand sewing this, then you could stop in between things like the windows. You don't have to do those lines, but when you're on the machine, it's easier to just keep going. You see, I'm moving the fabric in every direction depending on where I want to go. I don't need to move the fabric, to rotate the fabric around. I can just go up, down, left, right, whichever way I want to go. Back out to the edge and down. And now I'll just finish off going around the rest of the green. Go around that little bush. Back out to the side and all the way down to the bottom. And then I'll go along the bottom so that I can do the path. And that's all I'm going to do on the machine. If I want to do any extras, I'll go back in with a hand needle and then I'll put in the details. Like I said, if you haven't got a sewing machine, you can just do this with the hand sewing instead. When you get to the end, make sure the needle goes up and down a couple of times on the spot, just to finish it off. Pull your foot up, and then I can trim that off. Why it's important that you put the foot down is that the tension of the top of the sewing machine doesn't engage until you've put the foot down. So that's why my particular machine, when I didn't put the foot down at the beginning, it was beeping away telling me I hadn't put the foot down. So you can roughly see what I've done there, stitched all the way around the outside of the house. This is one of my boxes of sewing threads. These are 6-strand threads. They're the kind that you use for cross stitch. I've got a big range of colours. They're DMC, Anchor, those sorts of companies supply these. You can buy them in Hobbycraft and online. And I am going to pick out the ones that I want to use on my house. So I'll definitely want a few greens. I will take a few out, and then when I'm sewing I can pick and choose as I'm going along. Have I got any black? Yes, got some black there. Might want that. Bit of yellow. What else might I want? I can always come back and get more, but I'm just going to pick out the ones that I'm pretty sure I'll use now. Nice little selection of them there. Yes, I think I'll go with that for now. And I'm going to use a normal sewing needle. You don't need to use a cross stitch needle for this because they are blunt on the end to help you to put them through the holes. So we want to use a normal needle, one that's sharp. And I will get myself a needle threader because it helps with this sort of thread to thread the needle, and a pair of scissors, and then I can sit down and just fill in the details. Now I'm going to start with the hand embroidery. So I'm going to put in a little bit of detail on these windows first of all. So I've got some black thread. You probably want to use about 40 centimetres, so about a shoulder width if you were measuring it against your body. And this is 6-strand embroidery cotton. Like I said before, it's like you use for cross stitch. And what you can do is decide how many strands you want to use. And if you pull one strand out, you just slide the other strands down, and there I've got one individual strand. I think to make the details show up, I'm going to use 2 strands. So I just pull out 2 strands, put those 2 together. And I've got a pack of embroidery needles here, just standard embroidery needles. They need to be embroidery, not tapestry, because we need the sharp tip. And if you've never used a needle threader before, you don't have to use one for this, but it's always worth knowing how, because they are really useful, especially when you're using thicker threads. So you've got the bit that you hold on to, and then you've got a little bit of wire here. You put that loop of wire through the eye of the needle. You then put your cotton through the wire loop, pull that through a little bit, and then you pull the wire back through the needle and it threads the eye of the needle. Really handy to know how to do that. And you want to have a fairly long tail and then a bit of working length, and as you go along you'll shorten your tail as you use up this working length. So you could put a knot in the thread on the back just in case it shows through as a bit of a lump. On this I'm not going to knot it, I'm going to go over and over a couple of times on the back. So I can see on the back where I've stitched with the machine. So I am just going to pick up a little bit of the wadding or your stiffener or whatever you've got on the back. If you haven't used any kind of stiffener, you might need to use a knot, or if you put it into the stitches very carefully that you've already sewn with the machine. But there, I've gone over and over a couple of times, once more, and then I'm going to come up to the front, somewhere that is roughly in the middle of my window, because I'm going to do a little cross on there. And I'm going to use a really simple stitch that's called back stitch. It's like your standard running stitch, except you don't get the gaps in between each stitch. So I've come up by the edge, I go forward a little bit and down, go onto the back. So that's your standard stitch like you would do with running stitch. Then I'm going to come up a little distance away, same sort of distance that I've already done with that stitch. And I'm going to go back down where I came out for that first stitch. And that gives me a line basically. So every time on the back you're going forward effectively 2 stitches so that you have a gap there. You pull it through and then you're going back 1 stitch. So it's kind of a jump forward, hop back, jump forward, hop back, and you keep doing that until you get a nice line. So I'll just do that up to the top. It's a really simple but really useful stitch. Just come up to the top of that window. And now I'm going to go onto one of the sides. So I'm going to make a crossed window. So underneath I can just bring up the needle where I want it to be. This is where it is quite useful to have a stiffener or wadding on the back, because the black thread could show through if you were doing it on just the white background. But because we've got the yellow, we've got this buff with the polka dot, and we've got the backing, nothing will show through here. But it's always worth thinking about, is it going to show through if you haven't got a backing? So I'm doing back stitch again, just across this section. This is the kind of thing that's quite nice to do in front of the TV, stick on Netflix or a film or something, or if you're into your soaps, put your soaps on and just sit there, and it's quite calming, quite relaxing. It's very rhythmical because you're up, down with the stitching. I do love to use my machine, but it's always nice to do a little bit of hand stitch as well. So I've got a really cheap old thread here, so I've just broken that. So I'm going to rethread my needle. I have a habit of using everything up, and someone's given me these threads and they're a little bit delicate. But I wouldn't use these threads on something that was going to get worn a lot, like a cushion or a piece of clothing that's going to be washed a lot, because they wouldn't last very well. But just on a picture, if I was going to frame this, these threads would be fine. The more wear something's going to get, the better quality threads you want to use. Okay, nearly there. Okay, go on to the back. And you can see my back, you know, it's not too messy, but it's not perfect. But that doesn't matter because no one can see it. I don't like it when people say, oh, it's got to be perfect on the back as well as the front. You can't do knots, you can't do this, you can't do that. I think doing something is more important than doing something perfectly. Because if you tell yourself you've got to do it perfectly, you'll probably end up not doing it. So I just tie a very small knot by going under a stitch that I've already got there, creating a loop in my thread, and then pulling my needle through that. It should make a fairly flat knot so that it won't cause too much of a problem. And then I'll trim that off. So that is one of my windows with the detail on. I will show you another stitch now, and then I will go and finish that off when you're not watching, because that might be a bit boring otherwise. I think I'm going to do a bit of detail on this bush, yes, like that colour. There's another very useful, very simple stitch which is called seed stitch, and it's basically just lots of single stitches dotted about. So a nice easy one to learn. Get my needle threader again. So I'll go onto the back and just go up and down a couple of times to fasten that off. Again, this isn't too much of a problem because I'm not planning on doing anything rough with this, but if I was going to be putting it in the washing machine a lot, I'd want to worry about that a bit more, make it a bit more secure. But for this, it's not a problem. So I'm going to do some seed stitches just dotted about to give this bush a little bit of texture. So I just do a single stitch, and then I come up somewhere else away from it, just a little way, and I do another stitch in a different direction. I don't want them to be too uniform. I don't want them to be all pointing in the same direction. Can't see the green very well. You can just about see it there because it's a good colour for this. So I'm just going to dot these stitches about quite higgledy-piggledy. It just gives it a bit more life than leaving it with just the plain fabric. And it's quite fun when you're just doing simple stitches that have an effect. And you can just enjoy yourself doing this. You could do this with a variegated thread if you've got one. One where you've got dark greens, light greens, it changes across it. That could look quite nice. I could put one more up there. How's that looking? Looks a bit more interesting. And then on the back, I'll just knot it off the same as I did before. So under one stitch, and get it to go through the loop of the thread once, and then I'll do that again. So under the stitch, through the loop of the thread, and up. And that's enough. So I turn that over. You can see that I've got the detail starting on the windows and then that little bit of seed stitch on the bush there. And so I can carry on and put in as much detail as I want all across this now. Here's my finished picture. I'm just going to take the pins out. And then I give it a quick iron because it's got a little bit ruckled up around the edges as I've been sewing it. So we want it nice and smooth. And I've just put a little bit of detail onto mine. A little bit of grass and the detail on the windows that I showed you. So I've kept it fairly simple, but you could put on as much detail as you want. You could, if you were doing a house, cover the front area in lots of flowers and plants. You could put things in the windows. You could have a cat and a dog. You could have smoke. You could do your house in a different style, like a really Gothic style mansion or something a bit more funky and wonky than this. Or you could do it nice and straight in a little country cottage type of thing. That's really up to you because you're the artist, you're the person designing this. So you can make it however you want it to be. And then when you've finished it, I'll need to cut down the bottom here to size, but I could frame it. So if I got a frame that was a little bit bigger with a mount inside, that would look quite nice framed. I could make it into a cushion, or I've got a canvas here. You can buy these in lots of places, not just art shops. Places like Home Bargains, they've got them. The Works often have them, and Hobbycraft, of course. And I could mount this onto a canvas. And once I'd trimmed it, what I would do is fold over the edges carefully, tuck it in, so that I've got a nice crisp edge like that. And I could do that all the way around and then staple it onto the back so that then it was secure on the front. So that's how you could finish your picture off. And I would love to see what you've done. If you want to share them with Criw on Facebook or Instagram, it'd be really nice to see what you've created.